Good afternoon, and thank you, my friend. I appreciate that very much, and thank you for allowing me a little time this afternoon to share some thoughts. First, you are going to hear, after our exchange, from a man who I did not serve in the United States Senate with, but who I, over the years during my service in the Senate, he left the year I came, one of the truly great leaders in the history of the United States Senate, and still stays very active in world affairs, and this country is better off because of it, and that's George Mitchell, who you will hear from very shortly. But I always appreciate having an opportunity to appear with George. It elevates my stature when I have a chance to be near him. And I just hope I don't embarrass him. That's what I always strive for as much as anything. But thank you again, and thank you for continuing to strengthen and carry on this dialogue and promote the conference and the exchange of thoughts and ideas. I don't know of a time, certainly in our lifetimes, when cultural diplomacy is more important. But probably more to the point, more relevant. We need not look too much beyond what has just occurred in South Korea, the Olympics, and I suspect you've all talked about that as an example, and it's a good one. I think of a very clear example of cultural diplomacy, because we all recognize, no matter where we're from, who we are, what we believe, that cultures are woven into a very large fabric of interests, certainly art, music, history, athletics, politics, governance, religion. You can't take any of those pieces out of a culture. And so I think in one sense that it is the underpinning of how people deal with each other, get along with each other, must get along with each other. And I want to begin my brief comments this afternoon, and then we'll go to question and answers, comments, insults, whatever you'd like, with this observation, because I think because our world is now so, as we know from all of the 24-hour news channels, with this constant bombardment of breaking news, breaking news, breaking news, the reflection that we essentially don't have anymore on history, on where did we come from? How did we get to this point? No time for that. And we're missing, and I think all countries are, we're missing a critical element here of answering these kinds of questions, but more to the point, how do we go forward? How do we all, over 6 billion global citizens, and demographers tell us we'll get to 7 billion, by 2050, probably sooner than that. How are we going to get along? How is there going to be more possibilities and prospects for more education, more hope, more opportunities, more food, better health care for all people, clean environment? And so I reflect on the historic, really quite historic time of the 10 years after World War II that we glide over, and unfortunately even Americans don't know a lot about what happened in those 10 years after World War II. What happened, as you all know, in those 10 years is a remarkable world order was built. Imperfect, didn't fix every problem. Certainly we have a lot of problems today in the world. But it was built on a basis and a foundation of common interests. So for the first time ever in history, coalitions of common interests were built. The United Nations, to start with. IMF, World Bank, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, Organization of American States, Latin America, dozens of international development banks and development institutions and organizations, exchange programs. And why was that common interest and those follow-up coalitions built of common interest so important? It didn't solve every problem, but the Soviets participated in a lot of it. Because they agreed with the West? No. But it was in our common interest. It was in the common interests of the Soviets, the Americans, all of mankind to cooperate where we could, to build a platform to try to resolve differences. You don't resolve differences up front. This is, I think, an issue that we are now seeing in North Korea. We're not going to solve the North Korean problem with their development of nuclear capability and weapons in the first meeting. The tough issues are settled into a negotiation, if you can get to a negotiation. And so these organizations have meant a tremendous amount to the world. Now, let's review an inventory what has been accomplished. No World War III. Every president, leader, king of any country after World War II went to their graves concerned about a World War III. No nuclear exchange. By any measurement, apply any metric you want. Has the world gotten better? Space, science, medicine, food production, education, cultural exchanges, so on and so on and so on. Absolutely it has. Now, what we have today that we're focused on as the trouble spots in the world, these were the areas of the world that were left behind. They didn't benefit. They did not benefit for different reasons from this world order. But the answer as we go forward is not to tear down that world order of these alliances and these coalitions, but it's to make them relevant to the times, to our challenges, to the realities of what's ahead, not what's behind. Not tear them down. All institutions must remain relevant or they will disappear, as they should. Same as leaders, same as companies. If you have a company, if your product's not relevant to what the consumer wants, you don't sell it and you're out of business. Pretty simple, really, pretty simple. And we're at, I think, one of those defining moments in history where we are seeing a new world order being built. A lot of differences between now and those 10 years after World War II. The main difference is that after World War II, there was only one nation on earth that had an economy that was left standing after the disastrous war of World War II. That was the United States. So we, I think, did the right thing. We led. We didn't dictate. We didn't dominate. But with allies, we led. And all of us built this world order that we have lived in for the last 70 years. Are there adjustments required now? Yes. Changes? Yes. Worlds change? Yes. But the big difference today is that one equation is totally different. The United States is not now the only large, important economy, power in the world. There are others. We are living in a time that's historic for many reasons, but one, the redistribution of wealth. We've never seen a time when there has been so much wealth in so many different areas, in so many different hands, in productivity, in any way you measure wealth, development of natural resources. That also adds to tremendous important new responsibilities for governments. What's bigger than the environment? If we continue to pollute the environment, those 7 billion global citizens that will soon be on the earth having to share this environment, having to share water and food production and the basics, not different political philosophies or tribal differences or religious differences, but the basics of mankind will be jeopardized. We hope, we all hope, that we're all wise enough and smart enough to address that now. So I go back to where I started, where you all are and why you're here and what you all do every day to help make a better world, and a big part of that is cultural diplomacy in every form, in every way. And it does include all these different dimensions. And it's something that I have noted as I have traveled around the world many, many times, many countries, as all of you have, certainly my friend George Mitchell has. And I will end this way, and then we'll go to your questions. I don't know how many countries I've been to, well over 100, probably over 125. And I've known the leaders, I've known people. I'm no expert on any of them or anything. But it has always struck me that there are some true common denominators, no matter what country you're in, no matter what form of government or what religion or what tribe. That is, I have yet to find an area that people do not value their families. They don't value the prospects for their families. They don't have some strong feeling about a religion, about a God, about something bigger than themselves. Now, they vary what that is, but when you really define it down to truly the lowest common denominator, we're all the same. We're all the same. And we make our own problems, truly. I mean, it is astounding to think today, in this age, in this world, in 2018, we're still killing each other because of religious differences, or ethnic differences, or tribal differences. I mean, it's truly amazing to think that. Just because someone's of a different religion and they're not hurting you, or of a different tribe, or a different ethnic background, there's where we got to go to work. That's what we've got to do. And when you have that kind of problem and that kind of instability, there are people, and they're evil people, who will take advantage of that for their own political end. And we see that today, and we've seen it throughout the history of man. And I suspect that's not going to change anytime soon. We've got to make sure that that is minimized and hopefully at some point stopped. And it's the next generation coming behind all of you and us that we need to help, not just educate, but prepare. And you help do that, and I applaud you for that, and thank you. And thank you again for having me. Thank you. Questions?
Now we have time for more than 2 questions, so please sharp your mind and use the opportunity to have such a charismatic person as Secretary Hagel to ask him questions. Please, Professor.
Secretary Hagel, my name is Philip Brenner. I'm professor here at American University of International Relations. When you became Secretary of Defense, there was a lot of relief because you had a reputation for being thoughtful and for being opposed to militarism. We talked earlier, before you came, about militarism being a kind of ideology that gets in the way of cultural diplomacy. Would you help us understand how you experienced that when you came into the Department of Defense?
Professor, thank you. The way I approached that job, that privilege I had of serving as Secretary of Defense for 2 years, was understanding that a nation's military is but one component, critically important component, certainly of a nation's survival, of a nation's freedom and rights and protection. But it is only part of the whole. And it should only be used, the military, as a tool for a higher purpose. That's why in our cabinet, for example, as George knows so well, it is the Secretary of State who is the ranking cabinet member, not the Secretary of Defense. Secretary of Defense is not even number 2. Because our country has always had a premier focus on not military first, very important, but diplomacy and other approaches and responsibilities of government other than just national security. The Attorney General, Treasury, all are ahead of the Secretary of Defense in the priority lineup, in the seniority lineup. So I have always believed that, and I've always believed strongly, as we fortunately in our country got started this way in our Constitution, civilian control of the military. And that's held very firm over the years. And I've always fundamentally believed all of that. So when I was Secretary of Defense, I always worked very closely with my counterpart at State, who was a former colleague on Foreign Relations Committee for 12 years and a friend, John Kerry. So it was pretty easy to work with Kerry because we knew each other and traveled all over the world with each other. But it wouldn't have made any difference who the Secretary of State was. That connection was, for me, was very important. Now, we had people in the military who believed that we should lead with the military. And I think we've had in recent past administrations people who have actually believed that, that let's invade first and ask questions second and then figure out what we do. I used to ask questions in the lead up and then during Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, have we asked the question, then what happens? Saddam Hussein is gone. Okay, then who governs? How do they govern? Who selects how they govern? So on and so on. We didn't have any of those answers. We didn't even think about those. And the military can't fix that problem. And if there's, I don't know of a better lesson, unfortunately for America, that painful lesson that we've learned over the last 17 years is 17 years in Afghanistan. And we're still in Iraq. Things are worse in Afghanistan than they've ever been. The Middle East is in worse shape than it's ever been. And I think a lot of that probably was perpetuated by our invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003. It set in motion an awful lot. We didn't think through any of that. We didn't ask those questions. So I always approached my job as Secretary of Defense on that basis, that we have unfairly, in many ways, I think, put our military out ahead and put the military in a position that there's no way they can fix these problems. The military can be part of it, but these are diplomatic solutions and issues that are beyond the capability of our military, as good as it is and sophisticated, and the people we have are tremendous. But we've asked our military to do things it can't do. And so I was always very careful, and I was certainly no dove, but very careful before we got engaged in any military conflict, and I wanted a lot of questions answered. I wanted them answered, too, from my own military, because there are some in the military, and we train a lot of our military to be quite aggressive. And what is the safety valve there is that it's civilian control, and it's not some aggressive general or admiral making any policy. So there's a balance to that. So I'll stop there, but if that gives you some idea of how I tried to do my job.
His Excellency, very nice to hear you. There's nowadays in the world is jihadi culture, terrorism culture, suicide bomber culture. You think this cultural diplomacy, soft power, how we are going to counter that kind of the culture? I just not consider you as a Secretary of Defense, but also as an intellectual person and a very enlightenment person. I heard your other talks too and read your book. I really want to hear from you on that issue. How we going to counter that kind of
Well, my
culture?
first answer to your question is, you asked the question, how are we going to conquer jihadism? The United States is not going to conquer jihadism alone. It can't. The people in the areas that are plagued most by jihadism, certainly the Middle East, but Africa, as North Africa as well, other places, there has to be some, getting back to diplomacy, coalitions of common interest. There's got to be a common interest platform anchor to the people getting enough of a common interest gathered so that the people themselves, and we can help, we will help, other nations help, and should help. It's in our interest to conquer, as you say, jihadism. We can't come into a foreign country and say we're going to conquer jihadism. ISIS was a good example. I mean, let's step back for a moment and understand what happened there. I mean, I was Secretary of Defense when ISIS came across that Syrian-Iraq border in the spring of 2014. 2 divisions of Iraqi regular soldiers laid down their weapons and ran. Therefore leaving all their American equipment, armored personnel carriers, tanks, rockets, everything. Now, what can America do about that? We trained them too, by the way. So what's the answer to that? This is a good example of my point. Unless the people of the country and the people there are willing to lead enough, certainly not run from a much inferior numbers and quality force of ISIS. ISIS was shocked. Our intelligence showed they were shocked. That anchored ISIS, that act in that entire part of Iraq. They went in and took the banks, the currency, took control of oil, took control of everything. How did we all were able to move ISIS out? Well, it wasn't just the United States. It was everybody working together. We've got a situation in Syria today that is different, but I mean, you've got in Syria, if nothing else, let's review what you've got, and then I want to get to the point about your question. So you've got a huge Russian influence with significant Russian assets there. Air base, they've had that naval base at Tartar, Latakia province for some time. You got the Iranian influence, Shia militias, Syrian regular army. The Turks are in there. We're in there, the United States. We have regular forces in Syria. Then you have the so-called elements of Syrian freedom fighters against Assad. Then you've got al-Nusra, ISIS, al-Qaeda, and probably another half dozen of different smaller brands of terrorists. All of those in this little country. Now, is there any common interest we have there? A lot of different interests. Assad's got to go, no, Iran's bad, no, so on and so on. Terrorism. Terrorism is the common interest here. And until you can find, when I say you, I mean all of us, these common interests enough that anchor, to try to get rid of the scourge that is plaguing everybody to start with, then hopefully you can start working through the rest of it. the rest of it being the future of Assad and the future of Syria. I mean, what are we doing, United States, with 2,000 regular troops? Actually, we have more, but they admit 2,000, and plus special ops and so on, in Syria. Then you know what's happening with Turkey, which I think is putting Turkey right on the brink of probably leaving NATO. And that hasn't just been a result of the issue with the Kurds, but we've known that situation for a long time. My last meeting with Erdogan, when I was Secretary of Defense, I've known him a long time. In fact, Joe Biden and I were the first two Americans to meet with Erdogan 2 weeks after his Justice and Development Party swept into office in December of 2002. Joe and I were in the Middle East for a fact-finding tour during December, and we went to see him. It just happened. We spent 2 hours with him. So I've known him pretty well since 2002, many meetings with him. Told me the same thing in the fall of 2014 that he has said to us, the United States, certainly me, for years. The Kurds are our #1 enemy. ISIS is not our #1 enemy. And the United States has rejected that. And I used to make it a policy, and I've said this to people, when I was a senator or Secretary of Defense and meet with leaders all over the world, I never, ever tried to convince a leader of another nation who his or her enemy is. I mean, that's folly. No, it's arrogance of the highest order and stupidity. If the Turks or any other country believe that this element is their most gravest security concern and their enemy, now you can give various options and opinions, but to try to convince them otherwise, it's like them coming to the United States saying, here, let me explain to you, Mr. Senator, who your enemy is, because you're not smart enough, and I guess you're not American enough to know that. It's the same arrogance. It's the same arrogance. And we make a lot of mistakes in the United States when we do that. We're not the only ones. We're not the only ones. So this has got to be a combination, to answer your question, of the people on the ground who actually live there. We don't live there. Now, I will end this way. In December of 2008, Prime Minister Maliki of Iraq informed President George W. Bush that he would not take a status of forces agreement to the Parliament for ratification to protect our American troops. America never leaves our troops in any country unless they have that protection. And Rice, Condi Rice, was Secretary of State at the time, said, well, I don't understand. Maliki's told me this story. I know Maliki very well. He's told me the story too, as did Rice. You Americans are seen as occupiers of our country. The Americans are aghast. What do you mean, occupiers? We freed you. How could we be occupiers? Well, all armies will be occupying armies if you stay too long. And it was George W. Bush that had to sign the agreement to pull our troops out, all our troops out of Iraq. It wasn't Barack Obama. Now, Barack Obama was fine with that, but it wasn't Obama. It was Bush. Bush had no choice to get all of our troops out by 2011. This is a good example of what I'm saying. Eventually, you will be seen as an occupier, and your effectiveness, your trust, the confidence in you will be gone. So you say, well, what happened in Afghanistan? Well, Afghanistan, I mean, you are experts, historians out there, that has really never been a functioning central government. I mean, there are a lot of people in Afghanistan that would like the United States to leave, sure. But the central government, now headed by Mr. Ghani, is essentially seen as being propped up by American troops and NATO. And I suspect that that's probably right. But not to belabor this, but I think you've got to have the cooperation, the focus, the intent, the commitment, the people on the ground who live there, whose futures are at stake here. Not ours. I mean, no, we don't want ISIS. We don't want terrorism. We don't want jihadism. But we don't live there. We don't live there.
We have a time for 2 more questions.
I'll give a short answer. I picked up a bad habit in the Senate. George talked too long, and George never did, but I.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. I'm interested because I'm an Afghan. I'm coming from Afghanistan.
You're coming from where?
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan.
Yes. I know all the problems, what is going on in Afghanistan. We are trying to convince the international world that the money, the facilities, and the resources coming to this terrorist group inside Pakistan from all over the world, especially from the Arab world, especially from the Middle East countries, and also the country which gave what can I say, safe haven to them as Pakistan. There are not only Al-Qaeda and only Taliban and different terrorist groups. There are a lot of terrorist groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Sepoy-e-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Jagavi, and other different terrorist groups which threat all the regions, not only Afghanistan, not only Pakistan or India or Kashmir. If we come together, all the countries come together, and to make a strategy how to stop receiving these facilities to these terrorist groups, how to stop Pakistan not to support this terrorist group. You are right that you said we have problem with the government in Afghanistan. I agree with this. We had problem with Karzai. We have problem now with Ashraf Ghani. But this is why. This is because that we don't have elected government. Most of our leaders are corrupt. The system is a corrupt system in Afghanistan. Warlord is involved to for example, to be the leader of the country. The people, they are trying to ask the world to listen to their voice. It means to bring a good governance in Afghanistan, to introduce a government which is elected by the people of Afghanistan. If you look to the last election, and the other election before last, all this was based on the what can I say, in the fraud-based election. So in this case...
Excuse me, because I want to get to this guy's question too. So if you want me to give you a question, you're going to probably have to wind it up.
Okay.
And I'll give you a short question.
Okay, thank you.
And I don't mean to be rude, but I think I just didn't want to, because I'm cutting in on George Mitchell's time. So.
Okay, good. So shall I go on or?
Well, do you have a question?
My question is, we have to stop receiving terrorist group support from the Middle East, support from Pakistan. We should focus on this. If we are, on the other hand, there are 2 circles in Afghanistan. One, Russia, Iran, China, and Pakistan. The other circle is India, Afghanistan, United States, and they are, confronting the policies in Afghanistan.
So your question, what is your question?
The question is, if we are going to prepare a comprehensive strategy, we should look and think on the way that the terrorists will not receive the body, the weapons, the facilities from the world. I can tell you, they receive support from Pakistan. They receive support from the Middle East. They receive support from mafias, which are drug, the drug mafia in Afghanistan, which are those warlords in Afghanistan.
I think that we heard your position and your message, which I think that it is interesting, but let's give chance.
I mean, as I said, it's a comprehensive issue. I mean, everyone has to participate and be part of this. And the situation in Pakistan, the United States, others have had difficulty with the PAC governments for some time because of exactly what you said, along that Afghan border and the protection of in those areas that you really don't have any government control. So
let me just allow one more question, because how we can avoid giving chance to Mark to ask the question.
yes.
Thank you. Just a brief cultural diplomacy question. Classically speaking, cultural diplomacy was always looked upon as the task of the State Department, if you look at the 20th century. At the Institute, we explore also civil society, private sector applications. My question for you, what role is there for the Defense Department to actually implement cultural diplomacy? Because very often the Defense Department is actually there, in a much more present way than the State Department. I see great opportunities there for the Defense Department to be more active when it comes to cultural diplomacy. What are your own thoughts on that?
Well, the Defense Department is very involved, very active, has systems, programs in place in every embassy. We have senior Defense Department officials, generals, admirals, that travel with the Secretary of State. Secretary of Defense has representatives everywhere in all of our diplomatic posts. And not just military attachés, but other representatives as well. So culturally, more and more inside over the last, certainly since Goldwater-Nichols in 1986, that point you've made, the Defense Department has been part of that, has to be part of that, if for no other reason than what you just said. The Defense Department is in 150 countries around the world. Some we have a bigger presence than others. But we have huge representation all over the world. So it connects with our job, and it goes hand in hand with the job of national defense. Has to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that...
Thank you very much.